Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Howard French, celebrating the release of the new book, The Second Emancipation. Howard French is a professor of journalism at Columbia University and a former New York Times bureau chief for Central America, the Caribbean, West and Central Africa, Japan and the Koreas, and China, based in Shanghai. He is the author of 6 books, including Born in Blackness. French will be in conversation with Kimberly Atkins Stower, a senior opinion writer and columnist with more than 20 years of experience covering politics, policy, and law. She is an on-air political analyst for MSNBC, a frequent panelist on NBC's Meet the Press, and co-host of the popular Politicon legal news podcast, Sisters-in-Law. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Howard French and Kimberly Atkins Stower.
Hello, everyone. Good to see such a great crowd on this beautiful day. And I give my thanks to Politics and Prose and also to you, Howard, for allowing me to be in conversation with you about this really important and riveting book that's also, in my opinion, very beautifully written. So I appreciate, I want to start, I usually ask, the question, why did you write this book? But I want to ask both why and the how. This is a book about Kwame Nkrumah, the first prime minister of a free, independent Ghana. But you specifically say that this is not a biography, that you're writing more with Nkrumah as a through line of a political movement, a global political movement. Talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. Thank you, Kimberly, for this act of generosity. It's for me to thank you, actually. Thank you to Politics and Prose. You guys didn't invite me here for Born in Blackness. I'll forgive you. But these are great questions to start with. First of all, I should say that driving here or riding in a car here, I saw lots of no taxation without representation frames on license plates, and that's just such an appropriate message for some of what we're going to be discussing here tonight. There are two things that I would say immediately in response to your question. One of them is that this book is more than a biography of Kwame Nkrumah, in part because it's the history of an idea, the idea being an idea of Black solidarity and a thirst, a restlessness of Black people expressed through the intellectual lives of notable people going well back deep into the 19th century. The answer to a question, how do we achieve some kind of wholeness for ourselves as peoples in a world that has done everything to divide us, to balkanize us, to subdue us, to oppress us, and to exploit us. And so that idea has acquired the convenient sort of moniker of Pan-Africanism. And so the book is really a history of the idea of Pan-Africanism. And that long predates Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was the most important 20th century avatar, I argue, of Pan-Africanism, but he's drawing on lots of different streams in the Caribbean, in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere in Africa. So there's that. It's also more than a biography of Kwame Nkrumah because I think I don't want to sound too grandiose here, but it's really a political and intellectual history of the 20th century written from the perspective of Africa, Africans, and the African diaspora. We have all read histories of the 20th century, almost all of which totally discard or discount the perspectives of Black people. And this is a book about how does the 20th century make sense to people of African descent. And that goes well beyond Kwame Nkrumah and his, however fascinating, his own personal story.
I was really struck by a part of the introduction in the book that sort of centers on what you're talking about. It's this idea that, and I'm quoting from the book now, Africans would not be freed by merely throwing off direct colonial rule. There remained an indispensable next step if one wished to break free from the fetters of foreign domination, the creation of a new world truly of one's own. Nkrumah fervently believed that Africans could only achieve this by forging much larger states, or at least federations that would remedy the curse of balkanization, a tainted European portmanteau and colonialism had inflicted upon them. That colonialism had inflicted upon them. This alone would give Africa's new nations, which were weak or puny as if by design, more of the scale and heft that they would need to prosper and fend for themselves in the world of distant but constantly imposing powers, if not superpowers. That made me think a lot of what's happening today, frankly, when you see the continued push for not racial equality, but racial recognition, for racial freedom, actual freedom in the world for Black people that seems to be so difficult to reach and maintain. Talk a little bit about Nkrumah's early life. You alluded to it a little bit, and how the views about what Africa needed were shaped by his time growing up, coming to America, going to Britain. How did those ideas start to form in his head before we get to his really incredible and to some controversial political life?
Well, I could spend an hour on that question.
Don't spend an hour because we got to get to questions
Right.
and we will get to questions later. So if you have one, hold on to them.
But in terms of his early biographical background, the setting of Nkrumah's birth is really, really important. He's born in the extreme southwestern corner of what would become Ghana. It was the Gold Coast. So extreme that he's on the border of the French colony next door known as the Ivory Coast. And his people, a very small minority group in Ghana called the Nzima, are sort of sprawled across that frontier. And so Nkrumah grows up from childhood, not with a kind of book-induced understanding of what balkanization is about, but a lived experience of balkanization. To go see your uncle or your cousin, you have to switch a colonial language, get into a canoe because the colonizers didn't build roads to connect their colonies, if they were French and English on the opposite sides of a border, and overcome many other sorts of barriers that were thrown up to separate Africans across colonial lines. And so Nkrumah grows up already with a sense of all of these things, just sort of set the stage for some of the other formative things that happened to him. His early life really is a set of extraordinary coincidences. He is the only child of a woman who was a junior wife of a man who had several wives, as was the customary practice in that part of West Africa. Ghana, the Gold Coast then, was a colony in which, or where the British had invested almost nothing in education. And so to send a child to school was an extraordinary accomplishment, an act of will for any African who sought to see that their offspring attained some kind of education. Kwame Nkrumah's mother was the junior wife, and she persuaded his father to spend the only money that the entire family and all of that brood would invest in education in Kwame Nkrumah. And so Kwame Nkrumah goes to a one-room schoolhouse in far western Ghana near the border of Ivory Coast. The British didn't run those schools. These were church schools. This happened to be a Catholic school. And the Catholic priest where he attended school recognized quickly in Nkrumah a lot of kind of intellectual precocity, a capacity for learning and eagerness to learn. And so that's the first blessing or grand coincidence of his life, that not only did his mother pull off this feat, but that the priest recognized something special in this kid. And then a colonial official comes and makes a tour of Western Ghana and has an encounter, visit to that school, encounter with the priest, some kind of exchange with Nkrumah, and says, we're going to do something with this kid, and sends him to Accra, or arranges for him to go to Accra to attend the first serious school that Britain had built in Ghana with British funds as opposed to church schools. And that was Achimota College, which was called a college, but really it was a boarding school, a fancy high school for the sort of select talents of this colony. We're talking the second decade of the 20th century. And at Achimota College, Nkrumah comes under a number of other notable influences that really set him off on the path that we will come to recognize as a political leader, but which also point to the past that I talked about, these roots of Pan-Africanism and its many streams. One of the schoolmasters was a man named James Aggrey, who had gone to Columbia University, where I teach as a student, which was, it's hard to say how rare that would have been, right? And so he had been to James Aggrey had been to Columbia University in the second decade of the 20th century, and also recognized in Nkrumah a lot of talent. And Aggrey was a follower of Marcus Garvey and had invested a lot of energy, intellectually speaking, in understanding the nature, the sort of structural racism in the world and the need for black people to stitch something whole together. And so Nkrumah comes under his influence. And at the time, during the time that he is at Achimota College in Accra, by another grand coincidence, a newspaper, a Ghanaian-owned or Gold Coast newspaper owned by a local businessman, was put in the hands of a very talented editor recruited from Nigeria named Nnamdi Azikiwe. And Azikiwe, it's really astronomical odds here, would go on himself to become president of Nigeria. Anyway, Azikiwe begins to crusade with this newspaper in his hands against British colonial rule. Eventually, they start threatening to put people in jail from this newspaper and to shut it down and the like. But this becomes another big influence on Nkrumah. Nkrumah makes contact with Azikiwe. Azikiwe also tells Nkrumah. Azikiwe had been to college at Lincoln College, a traditionally a black HBCU in Pennsylvania, and said, now Nkrumah's hearing it for the second time. You should go off to the United States to study. Don't go to Britain to study. And Azikiwe ends up writing the recommendation letter that gets Nkrumah into Lincoln University. And so I'll just stop there because I could keep going.
Well, you anticipated my next question, because you write about all of the influences that helped make him who he is and helped create the political thought and ideology that he adopted. But part of that, a crucial part of that, was at an HBCU in America, which must have been a culture shock in so many ways. Just unimaginable ways. But he is here, he lands in a place of black excellence in an institution. Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, before even that happens, he stops off in Harlem for a brief stay in Harlem, and it's at an incredibly effervescent time in Harlem. Yes. Harlem had a pretty exciting 20th century overall, but we're talking the early 1930s now, and Harlem had been through a period of, it's past the peak of the Harlem Renaissance, but there was a lot of social unrest, and there had been major riots in Harlem and a lot of black nationalist movements contending among themselves in Harlem. And so that's his first exposure to black life in America and to what might conventionally be called radicalism, right? And so before he even sets foot at Lincoln University, he's exposed to all of this, and then goes off to Lincoln University, and quickly emerges. It quickly emerges that this is the sort of first blush of a sense that Nkrumah has leadership qualities. And Nkrumah didn't have any money to pay for the university. He basically talked himself into his student status at Lincoln University, and then had to figure out how to pay for it on the fly, which is a neat trick. I don't think you can do that very easily.
I didn't figure out how to. I didn't do that with my education.
And so Nkrumah did a variety of things. The other students hired him to write their papers. Nkrumah, having been trained received his early, he thought he might want to become a Jesuit priest. He had taken Catholicism very, very seriously. So he takes that and sort of does an entrepreneurial turn with that, not in Catholic churches, but as a guest preacher in African-American churches in the Mid-Atlantic and places like Philadelphia and Baltimore and the like. And this becomes a training ground for him as a public speaker and as somebody who knows how to read an audience and how to meet them where they are and how to sort of raise the energy of the audience and to sort of bring them along, all of which would become very important qualities for him. And then he begins to wander further afield. He begins to visit Washington, D.C., where we sit, at a time when Howard University Howard University remains a very important place, but I think Howard University was even more special, perhaps much more special in this era. It was really the sort of the center of gravity of Black intellectual life in the American university world. The roster of stars at Howard University at this time is just breathtaking. And so Nkrumah's making these forays to Washington, D.C. and meeting these characters, C.L.R. James and people like that, and falling under their influences. And all of these threads reach back into this Pan-Africanist past that I spoke to, but also point toward the future because the contacts that he makes in Howard University. By the way, Howard University in this era, the era we're talking about, now the late 1930s and into the 40s, had the highest percentage or ratio of international students of any college or university in the United States. Howard University was an international university by vocation, expressly. And because it is an HBCU, that meant Black people, right? And so this is putting Nkrumah on this forward-looking path of how to pull together these threads or these different strands from thinkers in the Caribbean and in Europe and throughout the United States and even South and Latin America.
So when did the idea begin to crystallize in him that politics might be a way, actual political leadership may be the way of his future?
It was important to me not to take this as too much of a predetermined sort of thing, right? I mean, you can see hints of this at every step along the way, but politics as a choice for him, an explicit kind of commitment to him, doesn't really happen all in one fell swoop. And the most important period, I think, is in Britain. After Nkrumah accumulates in a rapid fire way 4 degrees in the United States at Lincoln. 4 degrees in
vastly different areas.
Vastly different areas.
I mean, theology, philosophy.
Yes,
I mean, just sociology. It was really incredible.
Yeah, and then he goes off to London, thinking he would go to law school, as you did, right? And he applies to law school and gets in, but he falls immediately under the sway of 2 different strands of Black activism in London, which this is an unfamiliar world for him. The first strand is one of the leaders of the sort of African student movement in London. And the other is a character named George Padmore, who becomes a very important figure in the book, who had also spent time at Howard University, but who is now based in London. And Padmore was in the process at the time of Nkrumah's arrival in London, which is 1945, of basically taking over the Pan-Africanist movement. Pan-Africanism as a formal movement already by that time had quite some pedigree. There had been a number of Pan-African conferences and congresses here and there around the world, dating back early into the century. W.E.B. Du Bois had been a leader of this movement in the early in the 30s, and Padmore, Du Bois is getting on in years, and Padmore is this young, much younger than Du Bois activist, incredible organizer, a person who fires off correspondence and writes columns for newspapers all over the world at a pace or volume that's a little bit hard to imagine. And Padmore meets Nkrumah in his first day in London. He had an introduction letter from C.L.R. James, and Padmore invites Nkrumah over to his house that first day and ends up making Nkrumah the Secretary General of the next Pan-African Congress, which would be later that year in Manchester, so in 1945. And this is the first blush of what I would say kind of a formal entry into the political sphere for Nkrumah. What happens subsequently, though, is a more explicitly political act. As all of this is happening in 1945, 1946, 1947, there is a group of elite lawyers in Ghana, mostly lawyers, some businessmen, from tiny Ghanaian, then it's not Ghana yet, Gold Coast elite, all of whom had been to Britain to study in the best schools in Britain. Privileged people of means, who are thinking about how to form a political party. It's illegal to form a political party, so they're dancing around the issue. How do we do this? One of the obstacles or problems that they had identified for themselves was, we're fancy pants lawyers who have been to Oxford and Cambridge and places like that. We really don't know how to talk to the masses in this colony where nobody's been to school and where people are living in a totally different type of reality from us. And so those lawyers wrote to leaders of the student movement and said, we would like you guys to send somebody to work with us as Secretary General of this thing that might eventually become a political party. And they all recommended Nkrumah. And so Nkrumah gets on a boat and sails back after 12 years abroad to the Gold Coast. And to compress the story a little bit, quickly has a falling out with these conservative people who are really going way too slow for him. And initially looks like he's going to take over the party, but then there's a formal break and he leaves that party and forms his own party, which you guys know the rest of the story. He's going to become the leader of what becomes Ghana. But there's this break.
Well, it's
right?
interesting because that mirrors what we've seen in other parts of the world in movements to try to gain liberty for Black people. One of the key differences is at what pace do we move? How much concessions do we accept? Is it a slow path, or do we want change now? And that was happening there in what would be Ghana the same way it was happening here in the United States.
So J.B. Danquah was the head figure of this political formation of lawyers in Ghana, and their inept slogan was independence at the earliest possible moment. Just at the level of phrasing,
whenever you get around to it.
Right? And Nkrumah said, hey, folks, no, that's not going to be the slogan. We need to have independence now, right? We need to have freedom now. And so this becomes the slogan. They're all, a tither about this, right? They don't really know how to handle, that's not their type, right? And so this is the proximate cause of the fallout between the two sides. And Nkrumah just totally takes over. He captures the imagination of the people. Nkrumah can deal high and low. He's an ideas man. He's a brilliant student. He has read more than probably, if you take half of this audience combined, he's just a voracious learner, right? So he can deal in ideas with the best of them, but he also knows how to speak to the common people. And this is really the vehicle.
So after the break with this group, there was a lot of peril that he faced, including being arrested in the attempt to form this newer, faster moving political movement. But it's incredible that that did not seem to slow him down in any way. If anything, it may have propelled him.
Well, so what happened is one of these classic political stories, a kind of Gandhiist story, a bit of a Martin Luther King story, right? Where he's not going to be martyred, he's not going to be killed, but being persecuted ends up, one can turn that to one's advantage if one's clever enough, right? And so that's what happens next, right? There's coincidental to the struggle between Nkrumah and the conservative lawyer group. A veteran of the British Imperial Army, a Ghanaian veteran of the British Imperial Army, organizes a strike, a consumer strike in Accra, the capital of Gold Coast, complaining on the basis that the British had promised all sorts of benefits to returning veterans. This is a thread of the narrative in the book that, among many, I should say, that I think people generally, even well-read people today, won't have any notion of. Africans played a huge role in World War II. Africans fought, a million Africans fought in World War II. How many of you ever saw a photo of an African fighting in World War II? How many of you ever read a story in mainstream press about Africans having turned the tide of war in any theater of World War II? And African Americans, by the way, in parallel, are also doing important things in World War II. African Americans, if I can divert just for a moment, had to actually insist that they be allowed to fight in World War II, right? The U.S. Army was segregated. There was a great reluctance to give any kind of role other than as kind of, logistics people to African Americans in World War II. So on this side of the ocean, we had to insist. Anyway, back to the African theater. So these veterans are returning. Ghanaians, as it happened, had been deployed in large numbers in what is today Burma, right, and played a decisive role saving the British Army in Burma. The British were getting their butts kicked in Burma, and the Ghanaian troops won the day for them. And they returned to Ghana thinking that they were going to get lots of benefits. The British had promised them, we're going to give you this remuneration, we're going to give you, pensions, we're going to do this, and it doesn't come through. And on top of that, there's runaway inflation. Why is there runaway inflation? Because the British, in order to favor consumption in Britain, British economy was totally flattened in the wake of the war. And so in order to revive the British economy, Britain imposed a kind of starvation regime on its African colonies and said all of the consumer goods have to be sent to Britain. And so with the scarcity of consumer goods, prices went through the roof. And so this veteran organizes a protest, and they try to march on the headquarters of the colonial government, and the British officer who is in charge of the constabulary orders his troops to open fire. And so they open fire. A bunch of people are killed. There's an enormous riot in Accra. Shops are looted. Places are burned. Nkrumah had not organized that riot. He had not organized that protest, I should say. Nobody knew there was going to be a riot. He had not been involved. He was out of the city when it happened. He rushes back to the city. Actually, got to give credit, one of the J.B. Dunkwa, the leader of the conservative faction, also rushed back to the city. So neither of them were like hiding out or pretending not to be involved. And the British rounded up all of the people who had begun to dabble in politics, including Nkrumah. Because they thought of Nkrumah as a radical, though, they singled him out for special treatment. They sent him to as remote a place as you could go in the northern part of Ghana, put him in a detention place in his solitary confinement, basically, with the exception the chapter is called Mongoose, because there was a mongoose for some reason in the detention space where he was kept. And he's eventually brought back to the capital, put in a communal cell with a bunch of other people, and Nkrumah trades his rations, food rations, with his fellow prisoners for, get this, for actual single squares of toilet paper. That's how rough it was even to get something so basic as toilet paper, and manages to etch out a program for his political party to run an electoral campaign on, secrets these things out of the jail, and Nkrumah's party wins the election by a landslide, not even close, right? And so the British are kind of, they're a little bit exposed here. They had allowed an election on the basis, on the supposition that this independence at the earliest feasible moment party was going to win, and Nkrumah wins by a landslide, okay? And so what the British then do subsequently, they couldn't, it was too difficult for them to simply cancel the thing or to deny him outright. And so what they did essentially is make him run for 2 more elections over the next 6 years before they finally hand over the keys of the country to Nkrumah and say, okay, we give up. You've actually proven that that you are the legitimate leader of this place, and we're going to grant you independence now. This happens in 1957.
And so that long before Mandela, who we do know about, we have this political leader who became the symbol of the fight against imperialism and rose to power to lead the nation that he fought for. And so here he is now, the first leader of an independent Ghana, and he hits the ground running in terms of the action that takes place in terms of economic policy, political policy, and is tremendously popular at the start.
Nkrumah is nothing if not a man with grand ambitions.
Yes.
And these are ambitions not of a personal kind. These are ambitions of a national and supranational kind. Nkrumah, as you've already gathered from what's been said already, is fired by this notion of Pan-Africanism. It's his North Star. It's his guiding light, right? And so he wins election for the 3rd time, and Britain grants independence to Ghana. There is perhaps the largest international gathering of all time in Africa for the occasion of his inauguration. British royalty came, Martin Luther King, and pretty much anybody who was anybody in American civil rights came. People came from China, the Soviet Union. Richard Nixon came kicking and screaming. That little funny tale about Richard Nixon, I suspect you know what the story is, right? So Richard Nixon is out glad-handing in a crowd of celebrants of independence, and he walks up to a man and he says, "What does it feel like to be free?" And sticks out his hand to have his picture taken, shaking hands with the Ghanaian. And the man turns back to Nixon and he said, "I wouldn't know, I'm from Alabama." Right? So in Nkrumah's whole thing, right from the get-go, is Ghana's independence doesn't mean anything so long as all of Africa is independent. And Nkrumah puts his money where his mouth is. The very next year, 1958, Guinea acquires independence in very kind of turbulent circumstances. Charles de Gaulle of France is trying to fashion some kind of newfangled condominium between France and de Gaulle knows that African countries are going to become independent sooner or later, and so he devises this idea that his country's colonies can remain part of France in some odd contraption of a state where they would have a sort of dual nationality, more or less. But they have to vote in a referendum saying that they will accept that France is the head of this new formation. In other words, they'll be independent but under France, right? And Sekou Touré, who is an analog of Nkrumah, the most important sort of late colonial period figure. He's a labor union organizer in Guinea. Campaigns against this referendum item, and it's voted down. And so the French pull up stakes in Guinea overnight. They rip out electrical cables. They repatriate their doctors from hospitals and teachers. They destroy bureaucratic records. They sabotage the entire economy. And Nkrumah floats Guinea's economy for the next few years with Ghana's own means. Wow. So Nkrumah's not just, talking about Pan-Africanism. Nkrumah's behaving as a Pan-Africanism. Nkrumah then begins to organize a variety of political conferences where he is inviting people from all over the continent to, aspiring, decolonizing figures.
So what was he trying to envision, sort of a United States of Africa? Was that the ultimate goal?
It's a little more complicated than that. I mean, Nkrumah, that's how he often gets characterized, and he had indeed at certain points of his life used phraseology like that. But in this period, Nkrumah is not saying United States of Africa. Nkrumah is saying in the late 50s and early 60s that we have to start by creating regional and sub-regional federations, and by doing so, we can have building blocks that will ultimately lead to a continental-style government. And so Guinea and Ghana are the first building block. They are not a contiguous set of countries. Guinea and Ghana have Ivory Coast in between them, but they form a formal union, Guinea and Ghana, in 1958, as Nkrumah is underwriting the economy of Guinea. A few years later, Patrice Lumumba is invited from the Congo to one of these Pan-African conferences in Ghana. Patrice Lumumba, really interestingly, and I developed this story at length in my book, Patrice Lumumba, who has indeed been martyrized, was really not a radical figure at all. He was not a let's rush toward independence guy. It's when he shows up in Accra and he sees Nkrumah giving speeches, Frantz Fanon giving speeches, Kenyatta of Kenya, and various other people giving speeches about independence, that Lumumba becomes radicalized. And so Lumumba goes back to Congo with, fire in the belly, and sets his country on a course toward independence, which totally shocks the Belgians, who had literally said independence was unlikely to happen before the lapse of a few more generations, right? And so, Ghana then forms a union with Congo. Congo's even further away from Ghana than Guinea is. And so Nkrumah, in the early stages, he's doing this in a piecemeal fashion and saying, let's see what we can figure out. Let's experiment with different configurations. We know that we can't form a continental government right away, but we can begin by putting together some building blocks.
So from there, we reach what I think you're talking about, this high tide of Pan-Africanism, this movement. But eventually things start to break apart for him. How do we get from this moment, because being conscious of time and we want to leave plenty of time for questions, to the point where he becomes decried as someone who is power hungry, dictator-like, and is ultimately ousted from office in a coup?
Before I come to the demise of Nkrumah, I think I have to address high tide. And, the high tide in the subtitle, Global Blackness at High Tide, really isn't a reference to Pan-Africanism within Africa. It's a reference to what's happening in the wider black world. I told you how the independence ceremonies for Ghana were the most heavily attended event, probably even to this day, internationally attended event outside of sporting events, probably in Africa to this day, right? This was a moment, this was a period, a number of years, mid to late 1950s to early 1960s, when, in a way that has been utterly and I think tragically forgotten, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, African Europeans, and Africans were united in terms of political organization, in terms of intellectual effervescence, in terms of fundraising and mobilization. That's just hard to imagine from the perspective of today, where people live much more sort of self-contained realities. And so that's the high tide. As for the demise of Nkrumah, like almost every question here, there's a 1 hour answer somewhere that I have to resist. But the demise of Nkrumah, I would sort of date to the beginnings of the demise of Nkrumah. I would date to the relationship with John F. Kennedy. Nkrumah was the very first head of state from anywhere to visit Kennedy's White House. Okay, how many of you knew that? Right? Who could imagine that today? An African leader being the first visitor to the White House of a brand new American president. We are now in the shithole country era, right? This is the exact opposite, right? And Kennedy thought, and Kennedy again is a very complicated person with lots of pluses and minuses, right? But Kennedy really did believe in the future of Africa. Kennedy really did believe that the United States had to connect deeply with Africa for its own good, for the good of the United States, as well as for the more kind of strategic purpose of competing with the Soviet Union, right? And Kennedy saw Nkrumah as being this extraordinarily talented leader who, moreover, was the first of firsts, right? And so he cultivates Nkrumah, and Nkrumah sustains a lively connection with him, and gradually convinces Kennedy to help finance Nkrumah's grand economic ambition, which was to industrialize Ghana by building what would have been, or what became actually, one of the world's largest hydroelectric dams, and so that Ghana could begin smelting aluminum from bauxite, which it has in world-class quantities, right? Kennedy, for reasons that are tied up with the Cold War, strung Nkrumah along. I think Kennedy really Nkrumah wasn't asking for the money, he was asking for loan guarantees. Very different. We talk about aid in this country like we're simply giving away money, which almost never is the case. Nkrumah was seeking loan guarantees, and every time, it's kind of like Lucy and the football, every time it looked like it's getting really close, some of Kennedy's harder line Cold War kind of counselors are saying, no, this guy is talking too much socialist sounding stuff. We can't, if no sooner than you sign up for this, then he's going to betray you and link deals with the Soviet Union, and et cetera, et cetera. And so this gets strung out for an extraordinarily long period of time. To make a long story a little shorter, in 1961-62, the international cocoa market collapses. Cocoa was the mainstay of the Ghanaian economy. It remains one of the three main sources of national wealth in Ghana now. And this, combined with the failure of the United States to sort of engage in a fulfilling way toward this industrial ambition of Nkrumah, really kind of collapses the Ghanaian economy. And Nkrumah responds to this in ways that really require a lengthier explanation than I'm going to give you. But, you have to go back to the beginning of Nkrumah's power in 1957, taking over a country where there had almost been no schools for Africans, where there had been no British effort to train civil servants. Nkrumah had to rely on he had a very weak hand in terms of human resources, in terms of people who had had experience, who had had the right kind of training and education to who he could staff ministries with and who could carry out programs. And so Nkrumah begins, I think partly by his very nature, but also by necessity, to micromanage things himself. He had discovered that he could give as many orders to other people as he wanted to, but those people not being capable or not being able couldn't carry the things out. And so Nkrumah tries to take on everything on his own. And as he's doing this, some of his, let me say, more cynical advisors begin to puff him up in terms of a personality cult, right? And so you take the economic collapse, you take the overextension of Nkrumah as, a kind of a man who has to put his finger in all of the dikes. You take the support that Nkrumah had given, the very strong support that Nkrumah had given to Patrice Lumumba in Congo at a time when, Patrice Lumumba didn't last a year before they were trying to overthrow him. The Cold Warriors and the White House and in Europe are saying Nkrumah is actually a problem. We have to get rid of this guy. And so these things combine. The United States, I don't make the argument in the book. I simply don't know. I don't make the argument that the United States overthrew Nkrumah, but I definitely think and make the case that the United States, that elements in the American government were happy to see Nkrumah go and encouraged the people who overthrew Nkrumah to act against him.
That bit alone is enough to get the book and read it, because that it is quite interesting. And now we've reached the point where if you have a question, you can line up right here at this microphone. We will try to get in as many questions, not comments or stories. We will get in as many as we can and start with you.
Yeah. Can you comment on Nkrumah's connection to Nasser and to Mandela, Egypt and Algeria during this time, 60s, 50s?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. What was Nkrumah's connection to Nasser and to Ben Bella in Algeria, Nasser of Egypt? Nasser was a grand figure in, first of all, we must say Nasser was an African, okay? A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people think Nasser was from some other place, like there's this thing called the Middle East or something. Look at the continent and you will find Egypt in Africa, right? So Nasser was an African, and Nasser had been an important example or avatar for Nkrumah, having fought off an effort by Britain, France, and Israel to take over the Suez Dam and to sabotage his regime. And so, Nkrumah had that example and was in frequent contact with Nasser. I don't think that Nasser played much of a role in domestic politics in Ghana, or he didn't provide the kind of economic support that Nkrumah, for example, provided to Guinea. But he was a forebear in terms of, a political example of a nationalist leader in Africa. And Nasser was important in another way, in that Nasser, at the same time Nkrumah was experimenting with these formations of a Ghana-Guinea union, a Ghana-Congo union, Nasser was creating unions with Syria and the United Arab, it was not called UAE at the time, I can't remember the exact name, but he was forming these United Arab republics at the time. And so I think some of the impetus for Nkrumah's initiatives came from that. Ben Bella was an Algerian leader during the civil war against France. I said civil war, I might have said liberation movement against French colonialism. And the Algerians provided a lot of logistical and ideological support to Pan-Africanists south of the Sahara in this period. Again, I don't think that, the Ghanaians didn't have a violent uprising. Nkrumah won independence peacefully through the ballot from jail. And so it wasn't the kind of case where you could say that the Algerians, having, waged revolutionary war against France, then inspired similar events in Ghana. That's simply not what transpired. But there was this period of conferences in Ghana that I alluded to earlier, 1957, 1958, 1959, to which the Algerians always sent delegations. And I mentioned Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was a representative of Algeria at some of these conferences.
Next question.
Hi. May I suggest that the John F. Kennedy's administration's suspicions of Nkrumah, also because of his association with the non-aligned movement. Nehru of India, Sukarno of Indonesia, and Tito of Yugoslavia. And I just wanted, my question is this. Nkrumah's contemporaries in Africa who fought against colonialism, Nyerere, Tanganyika, Leopold Senghor, all people of great substance, character, albeit with flaws. So my question is, I mean, if you look at Africa today, you have people who are not willing to leave, and what accounts for the deterioration in the quality of, I mean, this is worldwide. You could talk about even our independence movement here. If you compare our politicians today with our founding fathers, the less said, the better. So, I mean, the question is, what accounts? Is it just because of the crucible of fighting for independence that creates these stalwarts, or is it something else?
So you've asked me really for a theory of history that escapes the scope of my book. I would just say this. So the title, I didn't talk about the title of my book, the other part of the title of my book, The Second Emancipation. And the title, this might help with your question. I've called the book The Second Emancipation because what we in this country normally think of as emancipation was an emancipation from slavery, right? When slavery ended in North America and South America, the Europeans turned to using forced labor in Africa to provide the same sorts of commodities that they were obtaining from the Mississippi River Valley and from Brazil and various other places. Forced labor. France and Britain argued in the United Nations, first of all, in the League of Nations, then in the United Nations, that there should be no language banning forced labor. They didn't, I think they were too ashamed to say we should legalize forced labor. They just vetoed language banning forced labor, right? Because they knew how much benefit they were acquiring from the exploitation of African labor, the theft of African labor to feed their economies with the kinds of commodities that they needed. So that's really the origin of that part of my title. Okay, so you asked me about the non-aligned movement. There's lots in my book about the political figures that you've asked me about, Sukarno and the like. The problem of this era was that as the Cold War heated up, the leaders of the United States saw non-alignment as a threat. The leaders of the United States, I mean, Eisenhower was explicit about this, that you are either with us or against us, that any profession of non-alignment is really a masking of your true agenda, which is to undermine the West, right? Or to go over to the Soviet side, just not to do so without avowing it publicly, right? And Nkrumah and the other leaders that you mentioned, excuse me, were in effect saying, say what you like, but we interpret independence as the right to decide for ourselves. We create national policies on the basis of our own needs, the needs of our nations, and not on the needs of the dictates of foreign powers, whether the foreign power is in Moscow or in Washington or Beijing or wherever. And so I started with emancipation because that's another element of this idea of emancipation, that independence is meaningless if it must include or it must accept the notion that you have to sign up with the agenda of some other power in order to be accepted. That's not independence. And so a second emancipation is not just a freedom from forced labor, from theft. It's a freedom from the imposition of an ideology or a sense of alignment from a foreign power. And this group of leaders that you refer to formed a kind of loose and mobile coalition of people who strategized and lent strength to each other at various moments in this period of the Cold War in ways that were tremendously important to each of their countries and to history, but are sadly mostly forgotten today.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to thank both of you for a very informative discussion. I would like for you, if possible, to discuss a little bit about one of your earlier books, China's Second Continent, and the evolving relationship between Africa and China, and whether this is going to be beneficial to Africa, and also a little bit about your experience in traveling throughout China and working closely with the Chinese people who are immigrating there. You may also want to talk a little bit about the black women who become the wives and, of course, the black children of Chinese descent.
All right, I'm going to keep you to one question because we're running low on time. But go ahead.
So I think I can do this quickly. I'm not really good at quickly, but I have a sort of summary statement about whether this is good for Africa or not, and it involves two particles. The first of them goes back to my last answer. African governments, African leaders have to, in order to succeed, have to make rational and well-founded decisions about national self-interest. And they have to be able to act in pursuit of and on behalf of national self-interest and not on the basis of the agendas of some other group of people or nations, right? That's how nations either do or don't function well. We have a rational policy-making process that has come to a keen understanding of what our interests are, right? Okay, so that's part one. Part two is what was happening in the world with regard to Africa's relations with outside powers prior to the return of China to the scene in a big way, beginning, let's say, in the mid-1990s. Okay, so the West had emerged from the Cold War essentially saying Africa doesn't really matter. You know, Africa is a humanitarian story. We have to contain disease. Diseases come from Africa. We have to be ready to respond to disease and to quarantine the continent when necessary. That was the essential take of the West toward Africa. Europe was not investing in Africa anymore. The Europeans, Western Europeans, rich countries, turned eastward to try to absorb the Eastern European economies into a greater European sphere. And the United States sort of set off in pursuit of other strategic ambitions and conflicts around the world. So Africa's kind of sitting there, ignored pretty much by outside powers. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, right? China comes along, and it's willing to do big things with lots of means. Okay, this doesn't mean everything's perfect. This doesn't mean China's going to look out for the interests of Africa. Africans have to look out for the interests of Africa. But if you ask me with a gun to my head, is it good or is it bad that China showed up? I would say to you, having more choices is always better than having fewer choices. And so China showed up, and here's some choices that didn't otherwise exist. In that limited sense, this was a good thing.
Last question.
Hi, the gentleman before me must have read my mind because my question is also about that book. But I'm a student of political science and African history at Northwestern, so very excited for the new book, but I did read China's Second Continent. And I'm wondering if you think that perhaps Nkrumah-esque Pan-African ideologies, whether that be through the African Union or ECOWAS, can be a method of resisting, if necessary, the great power competition between China and the U.S. and the geopolitics occurring there?
So I don't really think there's a great power competition for Africa. I mean, I really don't. I think that China remains engaged with Africa in important ways, but that China's economic commitments to Africa have peaked. I don't think China's going to go away, but I think the period of hot romance is over, and China is, had a long extended period of learning about how they can make money and where the best risks are, and after their initial exuberance, they are being more sort of careful about things. And the United States essentially sees Africa much in the ways that I described earlier, like as a humanitarian story, although humanitarianism is not a big thing in Washington anymore. A place to contain diseases, that remains a big item, and a place where, you got to watch out, there could be terrorists. So this is pretty much the extent of the geopolitical interest of the United States in Africa as best I can detect. The economic interest in Africa is one of resource extraction. And the United States, for the most part, is limited, has largely been limited over the last 25 years or so to oil and gas, and has woken up belatedly to the notion that China has prospected rare minerals throughout the continent to an extent that gives it a competitive advantage vis-a-vis the United States. And so the United States is scrambling to figure out how it can get back in the game in terms of minerals. But a great power competition for Africa, I don't really think that's where we are. Where I think we are is that African countries have to return to Nkrumah's idea of looking to each other as their principal resource, looking to connections with the broader black world as their principal lobby, and figuring out ways to understand to reap the benefits of valorizing themselves, as opposed to waiting for the day when something's going to come over the horizon from far away and deliver some beautiful package that's going to grant salvation or uplift. I don't think that's happening. I don't think it's coming.
Well, if you all join me in giving a warm thank you to Howard French for this enlightening conversation.